Hi everybody, today I'm going to read a story called Message, first published in Willawaw, you can't read that, Willawaw, an Anthology of the Marvelous from across the pond, published by the University of Glasgow. So like I said, this is called Message. When they emerged from the cloud and the plane no longer had a left wing, the women realized at once that they had time only to write before they went down. A massive cumulus had appeared on the horizon, a blackhead splotch of bruised purple and yellow, the streaky color of oil on a freshly asphalted road just after an afternoon sun shower. The wing had simply vanished, as if it had never existed. A frantic energy descended on the cabin as the passengers started rooting around in their carry-on luggage for pens and paper. One woman in first class had a spiral notebook and began ripping out pages and passing them back, making sure that everyone else had a way to record herself before focusing on her own well-being. Another began crying when she realized she had no pen, but the woman seated next to her offered her own after writing down only a few sentences in blocky print on a small scrap of paper torn from the blank last page of the mystery novel she'd been reading. Her generosity only made the penless woman cry harder, her tears dampening her own piece of paper with penny-sized splotches. The two flight attendants started up and down the aisle, collecting pages as women finished them. Passengers would thrust their arms in the air, waving their sheets of paper, and once the attendant saw, she would bring over one of the empty champagne bottles. A first-class passenger had drank one of the bottles all by herself before takeoff to steady her nerves, but when the flight attendants realized one bottle wouldn't be enough to fit everyone's pages, they'd popped a second, passing it around for women to take hearty sips of as fast as they could. Teetering and jarring turbulence as the plane dipped toward the ocean did not cause the women to waver. Those that were scribbling kept their heads down, writing hands moving with ferocious delicacy, their other hands splayed out to keep the pages steady on their tray tables. The pilot, the only man on board, was doing his best to keep the aircraft as smooth as possible. His voice crackled over the intercom system, bloated with regret, words sticking together like mushy rice. His apologies lingered in their ears for only a moment, overwhelmed by the autobiographies the women needed to jot down before the plane hit water. There were further struggles. One woman had nothing but a celebrity gossip tabloid to write on, her pen sliding across the slippery pages and leaving no words behind, as if she were armed with invisible ink. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, her chest heaving with worry. Another spilled her complimentary water all over her sheet of loose leaf, leaving the waterlogged mess transparent and soggy. The words wilted into stringy threads. And another, armed with only the magazine from the seatback pouch in front of her, worried that her words would fuse with those printed on the page, which she wrote over because she had large, loopy handwriting. She feared that the story that would be plucked from the bottle about her would leave her resurrection pretzeled and deformed. In the back row of the plane, a woman sat next to her daughter, who was wailing and pressing her hands against the window, smudging them with her sweaty, terrified fingerprints. No one told her to stop. The mother didn't try to calm her. Instead, she was busy telling her daughter's story, ignoring the cramp in her hand as she wrote furiously. The woman knew shorthand, but worried what cropping her child's life might do to her when the bottle was uncorked and the girl's pages read, whether the person who found it would understand those archaic-looking symbols or perhaps write them off as doodles, tossing the paper aside. No, the woman decided, it was important to write out every word, every flourish, every single letter with as much clarity and precision as possible. She knew she would only have time for one of them, but what more can a mother do than sacrifice for her child? The plane was shaking and teetering in a constant tremor as the flight attendants gathered up the last of the pages, each one rolled into a tight scroll and shoved into one of the champagne bottles. It took some wedging, and both flight attendants' fingers hurt when they were finished, but every woman's story was recorded and safe inside one of the two emerald-colored bottles. All the passengers watched as the flight attendants struggled to recap them, their arms flexing in their shirt sleeves, beads of sweat forming on their foreheads. As the plane jerked, their bowed elbows smashed against the sides of the galley, but their faces betrayed no pain. Just as one flight attendant managed to secure her bottle, a first-class passenger stood up, yelling for the second to wait. "What about your stories?" The woman with the spiral notebook held it up for the flight attendants, who each hustled to jot down a slapdash version of herself. Passengers worried that these would be unfinished, too, stick figure for a true reformation, that whatever came out of the bottle would be half a person, some monstrous almost version of what had once been. The flight attendants did not seem to have this concern. They both wrote quickly, their pages pressed up against the front restroom door, which wobbled as the plane continued its descent. Passengers in the first few rows could tell that these women were writing incomplete stories. There was plenty of blank space left when they each rolled up their sheets quickly. One of the flight attendants, her face weather-beaten from flights and subsequent stays in the Caribbean and Morocco for the better part of 2 decades, accidentally tore hers, a rip right through the middle. She shoved it into the champagne bottle without hesitation. When the other flight attendant, young, brunette, heavy makeup, plucked up the phone for the intercom system, the only noise in the aircraft was the shudder from its turbulence shivers. Every woman on board was staring toward the front, listening while the flight attendant explained that, for the security of the bottles, the two of them would jump out, prior to impact, so as to stay away from the crash site and keep the bottles intact. It was imperative, then, that everyone secure their seatbelts fast, for the compromising cabin pressure when the doors opened could suck someone out. The passengers found this pronouncement somewhat absurd. If they were going to crash to their deaths anyway, why did it matter if they were vacuumed out of the plane? This thought ran through all of their minds, aside from the young girl in the back, who was still sobbing, a pool of tears staining the collar of her t-shirt. But no one said a word. They all watched as the flight attendants wrestled with the cabin door, each struggling to unlatch it with one hand, the other, of course, clutching a precious champagne bottle by the neck. Eventually, the door disengaged with a cork pop, and both flight attendants were immediately pulled out. At the same time, the emergency oxygen masks descended like so many exotic translucent snakes. Per the instructions given at the beginning of the flight, the mother in the rear of the plane fitted hers on first, and then her daughters. Several women simply knocked the bags out of the way, worried little now, so close to the end of this journey, about being able to breathe. A few began panicking as the wind swirled through the cabin, hands shaking as they pulled at the elastic bands. These were women convinced that in moments of crisis they would be cool and calm, limbs steady, hearts slow and regular. A woman in the emergency exit row nearly passed out, despite telling herself when she boarded that she was the perfect person to handle a mid-air crisis, that she could keep her breath still and her head clear. But as soon as the wing had disappeared, she had felt lightheaded, her vision swirling with pinkish-yellow light, the color of sunset and bath bubbles. She felt ashamed by her inability to remain settled and grounded, and when acceptance finally set in her gut, she blushed, looked around, and felt a warm relief that those around her had not noticed how shaken she'd been. The ocean was close enough that those in window seats could see the movements of the water, little chops of contrasting color along the expansive deep blue. Amidst the creaking, rattling chaos of the fall, one woman noticed that the plane must be crossing the meeting line of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, one side a dark, near-black blue, the other the turquoise Caribbean color she associated with resort beaches. It looked like the seam along a quilt, a spray of white foam stitching the two seas together. The cabin was a whirlwind of distractions, overhead compartments flying open, carry-on bags descending like rocks in an avalanche. More than one woman was hit on the head, blood dribbling down, getting in her eyes and mouth. Copies of Sky Mall flew up in the air, fluttering like a flock of confused birds. The women knew the end was near, and the plane was in a sharp dive now. The pilot had remained silent through all of this and was no longer able to retain control. The plane dipped forward like a roller coaster car, cresting a peak and hitting the big fall. Stomachs flopped, eyes closed, grips tightened. But to alleviate the fear and terror that had finally made its way into most of their fingers, the women thought about those champagne bottles that must be bobbing out in the ocean somewhere. It might take time, years, centuries even, for them to be found. But the women held on to the hope and knowledge that they must be found, that someday someone would find them and open them, all of those pages bursting out like erstwhile bubbles. As the aircraft continued its fall, the water so close now it filled up the view through the windows, the smell of salt water filtering through the open cabin door. A sense of celebration cleaved to the walls of the plane, the women realizing that, though this was one end, it was also a beginning. This descent was not their final one, this crash landing in the sea a temporary stay. The words bobbing along the water somewhere held another chance, a life that would spring forth as soon as their stories were read. All they had to do was hold on to their armrests, close their eyes, and wait for that day to come. I believe, they said in unison, as the plane hit the water. The end.